The Mississippi doesn't move fast, not the way most people imagine it. It crawls, it bends, it murmurs, and then, when it decides to change its mind, it rewrites geography. On a fog-heavy morning near the river's bend south of Vicksburg, I watched the current pull slow ribbons of silt downstream, like someone dragging a brush across an old painting, smearing history into something new. I was there because of a single line in a century-old engineering report I'd found in the archives at Louisiana State University. Buried between notes on levee construction and soil composition, one entry read, "Site abandoned, 1874. Remnants submerged. Federal order. No excavation permitted." No name. No coordinates. Just a line, half erased by time and bureaucracy. That fragment became the first thread that led me here, to a stretch of mud and cypress where locals whispered about a vanished settlement they called the Sunken Town. The river's memory. Locals always personify the Mississippi. To them, it's not a river, it's a will. Every few decades, it decides to erase something, an island, a ferry route, a town. Standing there, boots half buried in clay, I realized how easy it would have been for an entire place to vanish under this moving skin of water. A retired surveyor named Earl Latimer was the first to speak to me about it. Earl lived in a one-story house perched on steel stilts outside Greenville, Mississippi. He'd worked for the Army Corps of Engineers for 40 years, charting shifts in the river's path. When I showed him the archival note, his brow furrowed beneath a ball cap stained from sun and sweat. He tapped the line with a calloused finger and said, "You're not the first to ask, but you might be the first to get close." According to Earl, there had been stories passed down through field crews, rumors of a lost township swallowed after a deliberate floodway diversion in the 1870s. Not a natural disaster, a decision. He leaned back in his creaking chair, the fan humming behind him. "They rerouted the river to save plantations upriver. Some folks said there was a settlement where they broke the levee. Whole thing went under in a night. They called it Providence Bend." I asked if Providence Bend appeared on any of the Corps' maps. Earl smiled. "Not after 1880. Funny thing though, satellite imaging in '02 picked up a rectangular formation under the silt line. Looks like old streets. Government said it was natural sediment patterns." He shrugged. "Maybe it is. Maybe it ain't." That night, in my motel off Highway 61, I couldn't shake the phrase federal order. No excavation permitted. If the river took Providence Bend by force, why would the government forbid anyone from digging? Old maps and new lies. The next morning, I drove to Jackson to comb through the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. The air inside was cold and dry, humming with the sound of microfilm reels, archivists. There had seen me before, another researcher chasing ghosts. It was in a collection labeled Post-Reconstruction Infrastructure Reports that I found the first real clue. A folded survey map dated 1873, drawn by a cartographer named J.L. Thorne. In faint ink, just south of a marked levee breach, was a boxed outline labeled Providence Settlement. A dotted line crossed through it with a handwritten note beside it. To be redirected, U.S. Order Number 4112A. I traced that line with my finger. It was the path of an artificial cut, an engineered channel meant to divert floodwaters. Someone had ordered the river to shift course directly through a populated settlement. As I photographed the map, an archivist named Marjorie Hollis stopped beside my table. She was in her 60s, glasses perched low, voice low enough to feel confidential. "You're looking at the Thorn maps," she said. "You know they pulled most of those from public view in the 70s? "Why?" I asked. "Levy lawsuits," she replied, lowering her voice further. "People started suing the state for land loss from decisions made 100 years earlier. The Corps didn't like anyone connecting the dots." Marjorie leaned closer. "Providence Bend was one of the towns the Corps sacrificed. There were freedmen living there, families that settled after the war. You won't find it in official town registries because it wasn't white land." She straightened, as if realizing she'd said too much, and added, "I never told you that, the vanishing records." The deeper I went, the thinner the trail became. County tax ledgers from 1870 to 1874 had missing pages. Church records ended mid-sentence. Even census data from that decade listed the area as inundated before the flood supposedly happened. That contradiction gnawed at me. If Providence Bend was underwater by 1874, why had the census called it inundated 2 years earlier? It meant someone was planning to drown it long before the water ever rose. I found a single surviving mention of the town in a railway shipment log from 1802. It recorded deliveries of lumber, seed, and, most curious, blasting powder to a P. Bend works. It didn't make sense for a small agricultural settlement to import explosives, unless they weren't for farming. At this point, the story was no longer about a forgotten town. It was about what someone wanted to forget. Night over the river. 3 days later, I joined Earl Latimer again, this time in his airboat. We set out at dusk, the sky turning that bruised purple that only Mississippi summers can make. The hum of insects built into a low electric wall of sound. Earl navigated toward a shallow curve where the main channel split into a silt bar. "This here's where it should have been," he shouted over the motor. "Ground sonar says there's something solid 10 feet down. Not rock. Straight lines." He cut the engine, and silence folded over us. You could hear frogs, the gentle drip of water against the hull. The air smelled of iron and decay. When the moon lifted, silver light revealed half-submerged posts jutting from the mud like gravestones. I waded closer. Beneath the thin film of algae, I saw brick, red, square, deliberate. I brushed the surface with my gloved hand, and the outline of an arched doorway emerged. Something built by human hands. And then, something else. A faint metallic glint in the mud near the base of the arch. I pried it loose. It was a corroded brass plaque, the letters barely legible. Providence Mercantile Company, Est 1868. Earl whistled low. "Well, I'll be damned." We took photos, measurements, coordinates. Back at the motel, I uploaded everything. By morning, my files were gone. The folder on my laptop labeled Providence Evidence was empty. No photos, no data. Even the recycle bin was blank. When I called Earl, his phone went straight to voicemail. The silence that followed. I drove back to his house that afternoon. The gate was chained, and the windows were dark. A neighbor, a woman in her 50s hanging laundry, told me Earl had left early that morning. Said some men in government trucks came by. No logos, just white pickups, and talked to him for a while. After that, he packed up and went north. She looked at me suspiciously. "You ain't another one of them history people, are you?" I didn't answer. That night, I checked local news sites. No mention of Providence Bend. No mention of any government visit. It was like nothing had happened. But one thing did change. When I opened the archive's online database to double-check Thorne's map, the record had vanished. No entry, no file. Even the catalog number redirected to a blank screen reading, "Restricted access under federal review." The letter a week later, a padded envelope, arrived at my apartment in Baton Rouge. No return address. Inside was a single object, a sepia photograph of a main street lined with two-story brick buildings. On the back, written in cursive, "Providence Bend, 1872, before the flood." Below that, another line in faint pencil, "They moved the river for profit." There was no signature, but I recognized the handwriting. Marjorie Hollis. I called the archive. They told me Marjorie had retired unexpectedly. No forwarding information. The quiet town that wasn't. Every historian learns that not all absences are accidents. Sometimes, erasure is the final act of control. Providence Bend wasn't simply forgotten. It was deleted. Still, traces persisted. In the soil chemistry, in sonar data, in whispered memory. Earl's sonar readings were still in my mind, those neat rectangular shadows under the mud. When I overlaid Thorne's 1873 map onto a modern satellite image, the alignment was perfect. Right where the channel widened unnaturally, the so-called cut of 1874, sat the ghost grid of streets. I wondered how many other natural changes in the Mississippi's course were actually engineered decisions. How many towns traded away for cotton, freight routes, or political favor, and who still benefited from keeping those stories quiet. The beginning of an investigation. In September, I returned with a small research grant from the Southern Historical Society. This time, I came with equipment, ground-penetrating radar, GPS beacons, and a cameraman named Luis, who'd worked on environmental documentaries. We set up on the same sandbar Earl had shown me. Luis filmed the process as I ran the radar sled over the mud. The data came back in waves, gray layers like the rings of a tree. At a depth of 10 to 12 feet, right where the sonar had hinted, were parallel vertical anomalies. Too straight for geology, too uniform for chance. Walls. We printed the scan, circled the structures, and packed up before sunset. The next morning, my research grant was frozen. The university's legal office sent an email citing land rights complications with federal oversight. When I asked which agency had filed the complaint, they didn't answer. That night, I drove back to Baton Rouge, and for the first time, I felt genuinely afraid. Because this wasn't just about a drowned town. It was about who had the power to erase it, and why that power still reached into the present. I opened the photograph again, tracing the inked words. They moved the river for profit. If that was true, Providence Bend wasn't a casualty of nature. It was an act of deliberate burial, and I wasn't supposed to find it. The road ahead. Before dawn, I packed my recorder, camera, and a stack of photocopied maps. There were still loose ends. Who ordered the diversion under Order Number 412A? What company stood to gain from the new river route? And why were modern agencies still guarding the site? As the first light touched the horizon, the Mississippi shimmered like a vein of mercury. Somewhere beneath that gleaming surface lay a town that once had streets, laughter, and names that never made it into history books. I started the engine and headed north. There was one place left to check, a forgotten courthouse in Bolivar County, rumored to have survived the flood, sealed since the 1880s. If the order to destroy Providence Bend existed anywhere, it would be there. And if it didn't, then someone had made sure of that. The Mississippi kept flowing beside the highway, calm, endless, indifferent, like it had secrets older than memory. When you chase a story that was meant to stay buried, the first thing you lose is silence. The second is sleep. For weeks after I found the photograph, I kept hearing the river in my head, the slow drag of current against silt, the muffled sound of something shifting below. I knew Providence Bend wasn't gone. It was just submerged under layers of policy, ink, and fear. So I did what any historian does when the present starts to vanish around him. I went backward, the order that didn't exist. The document that started it all, U.S. Order Number 412A, wasn't supposed to exist anymore. It had been referenced only once in the corner of that 1873 map by J.L. Thorne. No official copy survived in any public archive. But the National Archives in D.C. held a microfilm collection labeled Mississippi River Engineering Division, 1868 to 1879. I filed a request for remote access. 3 days later, I got an email that said simply, "Collection temporarily restricted pending review under Section 12. Contact not permitted." Section 12 doesn't refer to classified information. It's an administrative hold for materials under dispute. Except there was no active lawsuit. No one knew what was being reviewed. So I went to D.C. myself. The National Archives smells like old glue and dusted cotton. Rows of metal cabinets, the hum of dehumidifiers, the click of archivists' shoes. It's a place where time is treated like a fragile species. At the reference desk, a woman with sharp eyes and a federal badge told me there was nothing under 412A. But when I asked for adjacent records, anything labeled between meat and fuss, she hesitated. After a long pause, she said, "You'll find 411 and 402. That's all I can say. File 4111 was an Army Corps Appropriations memo, authorizing dredging equipment purchases for Delta realignment operations. File 4 contained letters between Colonel James F. Riley, Chief Engineer, and a civilian contractor named Edwin Merritt, discussing delays due to local resistance. One line in Riley's letter froze me. Upon receipt of 412A, commence without further consultation. Ensure the record of the settlement is voided per standard protocol. There it was, confirmation that 4112A had been real, even if the paper was gone. Local resistance. That phrase was the first breath of humanity the documents had offered. Someone, somewhere, had fought back, the survivors who weren't counted back in Mississippi. I searched church rosters, freedmen's bureaus, and post-war relief lists for names connected to the area. Most had been erased, but a few fragments remained in a Reconstruction census supplement. Under Providence Bend Precinct, 4 households were listed before the notation, "District dissolved, population relocated." One of those names stood out. Amos H. Dunbar, age 42, occupation carpenter. Beside his name, an asterisk linked to a note at the bottom. Testified, May 1875. Delta Realignment Inquiry. An inquiry meant a hearing. A hearing meant transcripts. I found them in a forgotten corner of the Library of Congress Digital Archive. U.S. Senate Subcommittee on River Commerce, 1875, Volume 3. Most of it was bureaucratic testimony, but halfway through, in faint type from a damaged scan, Amos Dunbar's voice came through. They came with torches and survey rods, said the river was to be mud to spare the plantations upriver. We told them this was our home, built after the war, on land no man claimed before. They said Washington claimed it now. He paused, according to the transcript, then continued. When we refused to leave, the levee broke 3 nights later. But it didn't break natural. I seen the fuses. That single line changed everything. If Amos Dunbar was telling the truth, the flood wasn't an accident. It was a demolition. The blasting powder trail. I remembered the old shipping ledger I'd found. Blasting powder delivered to P. Bend Works in 1872. So I traced the sender. The Delta Freight Company, a short-lived logistics line absorbed by Illinois Central Railroad in 1876. Its records were stored in a defunct warehouse in Chicago, now managed by a private archival firm. Inside their catalog, one entry caught my eye. Invoice Book Number 6, Explosives, Southern Division, 1871, 1873. I paid for digital access. Half the pages were smudged with soot or water damage, but a few remained legible. Among them, shipment, 400 Pontonbills powder, 36 fuses. Destination, P. Bend Works. Recipient, E. Merritt. Edwin Merritt, the same contractor corresponding with Colonel Riley. In the margin, a clerk had penciled, "By order 4112A. There it was again, the invisible order that had condemned a town. Letters from the dead. Finding Merritt's own papers was harder. He wasn't a famous figure, just one of countless civilian engineers who helped tame the Mississippi. But his family donated a box of his letters to Tulane University in the 1950s. Most were personal, but one, dated July 1874, written from Vicksburg, began with unease. The work proceeds under veil of necessity, yet I cannot escape the sight of their eyes watching from the bank. They were promised relocation, yet no wagons came. When the charge was lit, I turned away. The rest of the page was torn. The ink stopped mid-sentence. In the same folder lay a receipt for 6 wagons, assorted supplies, stamped Merritt and Company, Providence Relocation Fund. But no records showed the supplies delivered. I photocopied everything, even the half-burnt envelope. It smelled faintly of river mold, as if history itself had been damp too long. Washington's silence. If the Army Corps buried Providence Bend to save upstream plantations, there had to be a financial motive. The congressional record from 1874 listed emergency appropriations for flood control. $1.2 million, a massive sum then. Contracts were awarded to private landowners who had suffered loss due to river deviation. Among them was Jonathan K. Barron, a cotton magnate from Greenville who owned 5 plantations along the bend. One line in the appropriations list read, "Awarded $24,000 for structural loss at Barron Plantation following levee break near Providence Cut." The same break that destroyed Providence Bend had compensated Barron. He hadn't lost property. He'd gained a riverfront. Barron's descendants still owned land there today, operating under a holding company named Barron Delta Holdings LLC. When I called their office pretending to research heritage water rights, a polite assistant told me no family documents from that era existed. But the next morning, I received an email warning me that continued inquiries into obsolete flood sites may constitute trespass under Section 27 of the Federal Lands Protection Act. The message came from a Justice Department address. It confirmed what I already knew. Someone, somewhere, still cared about Providence Bend staying buried. Voices from the margins. While combing through regional papers from the 1870s, I found a brief note in the Vicksburg Times, dated August 1874. Heavy damage reported near New Cut, south of Greenville. Several colored settlements lost. Relief to be coordinated by Freedmen's Bureau. That was it. No names, no outrage. But the Freedmen's Bureau field reports told a longer story. An agent named Major Elias Carver filed a complaint that same month. Flood at Providence Bend appears induced by deliberate channel excavation. 23 families displaced. Requests for aid denied by District Command. Carver's letter was stamped "Received," then crossed out in red pencil. He was later transferred to Kentucky. I found his obituary years later. It mentioned his unusual commitment to fairness in reconstruction efforts. No mention of Providence Bend. The engineer's diary. In December 1874, 2 months after the flood, Colonel Riley wrote one final report to the Chief of Engineers in Washington. That document survived in full. Realignment successful. New channel established. Loss of settlement unavoidable but strategically necessary. Recommend sealing all subordinate correspondence. Below, in smaller handwriting, pursuant to 412A, this division shall not retain field notes. Disposal by fire authorized. It explained why so little remained. They had destroyed their own records. But in the margins of that same report, someone had scribbled later in blue ink, "Copy retained. Bolivar Courthouse. Box 7. That single annotation led to the next step. The courthouse I had already planned to visit. It wasn't a rumor. It was an instruction. Echoes in the archive. Before driving north, I wanted to understand how something like this could happen. So I met with Dr. Helen Grady, a historian at the University of Southern Mississippi, who specialized in reconstruction infrastructure. She wasn't surprised when I told her about Providence Bend. After the war, she explained, freed communities along the river built towns on marginal land, areas abandoned by planters. When the Corps needed floodways or navigation channels, those were the easiest targets. No titles, no lawyers, no press. Would the government really erase an entire town to save a few? Plantations? I asked. She sighed. It wasn't just plantations. It was trade. The Mississippi carried cotton, timber, coal. Every hour of blockage cost someone money. Providence Bend might have been small, but it was sitting in the wrong curve, one that slowed down the riverboats. Her words hung in the air like humidity. Before I left, she handed me a photocopy of a page from an engineering journal, dated 1911. A retrospective article on the great river improvements of the 19th century mentioned the successful diversion south of Greenville, unfortunately resulting in loss of certain unregistered settlements. Unregistered. That was the bureaucratic word for erased. The hidden box. The Bolivar County Courthouse sat on a slight hill above a field of winter weeds. It hadn't been used in decades. The new courthouse operated closer to Cleveland. Dust coated the windows like frost. With permission from the county clerk, an older man who laughed when I asked about Box 7, I descended into the basement. The air smelled of mold and forgotten ink. Rows of wooden shelves held decaying boxes. Their labels were half illegible, years reduced to stains. But there, on the lowest shelf, was one marked in faded stencil, Bolivar, Box 7. Inside were water-stained folders, fragments of typed memos, and one bound ledger titled Providence Project, 1873. Its first page was signed by E. Merritt. The entries detailed material shipments, wages, and, buried between budget lines, a chilling note. Night operation successful. Settlement cleared by 02:15. Minimal resistance. Levee break scheduled per order. He'd recorded it like any other transaction. The ledger continued. Compensation vouchers for plantation owners filed. Laborers dispersed. At the back, a thin envelope contained 6 photographs. Blurred figures, wagons, tents. The last showed a stretch of land collapsing under floodwater. Across the bottom, handwritten in pencil, Providence Bend, August 1874. I held that photo for a long time, realizing this was likely the only surviving image of the town's destruction. Each face in it had been deleted from history, yet here they were, surfacing again. The government's final word. When I presented my findings to a contact at the Corps' modern office in Vicksburg, a younger engineer named David Nguyen, he reviewed the evidence silently. Then he said, "Off the record, you're not wrong. But some stories, we're told to leave them in the mud." "Why?" I asked. He looked out the window at the river. "Because if Providence Bend happened once, it probably happened more than once, and no one wants to open that ledger." He slid a note across the table, a phone number. "Someone from Washington called about you," he said quietly. "If they ask, we never met." The number traced to a federal public relations office that refused to confirm or deny any knowledge of Providence Bend. The following week, my apartment mailbox contained a thin white envelope. No return address again. Inside was a photocopy of the first page of Order 412A. The text was brief. "By directive of the War Department, all obstructions to river commerce between Greenville and the lower Delta are to be removed by any means necessary. Compensation to affected citizens shall be rendered at discretion of commanding officers. All correspondence relating to this order is to be destroyed following completion." At the bottom was a signature, J.K. Barron, acting deputy for the Mississippi River Commerce Board, the same man who profited from the diversion. The document was unsigned by any government officer. It wasn't official. It was orchestrated. The story beneath the surface. Every piece fit now. Freedmen built a settlement on unclaimed land. Powerful landowners lobbied to divert the river for trade. The Corps executed the plan under the unrecorded Order 412A. When the town resisted, they detonated the levee. Records were purged to avoid political fallout. The Mississippi didn't take Providence Bend. Men did, and for a century and a half, their silence was as thick as the silt that covered the town's remains. As I closed the ledger and sealed the courthouse box again, I thought of Amos Dunbar's testimony. He'd seen the fuses. He'd tried to warn Congress. And like the river itself, his words had been buried, until now. I stepped outside. The late afternoon light glowed amber over the fields. Somewhere beneath that soil, brick by brick, Providence Bend waited to breathe again. History has a strange way of resurfacing. Sometimes it comes back as a rumor, sometimes as a photograph mailed in secret, and sometimes as the slow churn of mud where the river forgets to hide its dead. When I returned to Baton Rouge that winter, the box from the Bolivar courthouse sat on my desk like a time capsule. Inside were the torn ledger, the burned letters, and the blurred faces of people who had once built a life between two bends of the Mississippi. I thought I'd finished the story, but stories like this don't end, they echo. The unveiling of Providence Bend. In early 2023, I presented my findings at a small symposium hosted by the Southern Historical Society. The audience was modest: professors, archivists, journalists. I expected polite curiosity. What I didn't expect was what happened after. During the Q&A, An older man in the front row raised his hand. He introduced himself as Calvin Dunbar, a retired postal worker from Jackson. "I think," he said slowly, "Amos Dunbar was my great-grandfather." The room went silent. Calvin had grown up hearing fragments, that his family once lived in a town swallowed by the river, that they left with nothing but a wagon and a Bible wrapped in cloth. He'd always assumed it was folklore. When I showed him the Senate testimony bearing his ancestor's name, his eyes filled with tears. "Every generation," he whispered, "we thought the river took us. Turns out men did." That moment changed everything. It transformed Providence Bend from a mystery into a reckoning. The forgotten cemetery. Calvin told me about a place his father used to visit, a patch of forest near the riverbank where wild irises grew. He said his father called it the Bend Grounds. Together we drove there that spring, following dirt roads that crumbled into marsh. The air was thick with the smell of cypress and mud. Dragonflies hovered over shallow pools, and there, between two leaning oaks, we found it. A scattering of fieldstones carved with faint initials. Most were unreadable, worn down by rain and time. One, however, bore a single word: Amos. The letters were crude but deliberate, chiseled by a hand that had known loss. Calvin knelt beside it, brushing moss from the surface. He didn't speak for a long time. We photographed and cataloged every stone, then submitted the coordinates to the Mississippi Department of Archives. 2 months later, state archaeologists confirmed it. Ground-penetrating radar showed over 40 distinct burials. A freedmen's cemetery, untouched since the 1870s. The state classified it as a heritage protection site within weeks. For the first time in Worcestershire 49 years, Providence Bend had an official place on the map again, not as a myth, but as a community that once lived, worked, and died on that bend. The return of the river. Once the news broke, journalists began calling. The Clarion Ledger ran a piece titled, "The Town the River Erased." Then, the Washington Post followed with an article that asked bluntly, "Was Providence Bend America's first engineered erasure?" Public curiosity grew. Satellite footage, sonar scans, even drone imaging revealed submerged outlines beneath the murky water. Rectangular grids, corners of foundations, and what appeared to be the remnants of a central road leading straight toward the modern channel. It was the same alignment I'd traced from Thorne's 1873 map. Science had finally confirmed what rumor had kept alive. The Corps of Engineers released a cautious statement acknowledging the site's possible historical significance and pledged cooperation with local historians. Privately, several retired officers reached out to me. One sent a scanned page from an internal memo, a declassification notice dated 1978 that referenced archival suppression of Providence realignment records. In the margin, someone had written, "Release denied, public impact assessment incomplete." They'd tried to bury it twice. Now, the river itself was giving it back. The academic reckoning. By summer, Providence Bend became the focus of a joint study between Louisiana State University and the University of Southern Mississippi. Geologists analyzed sediment layers. Historians cross-referenced land grants. Descendants submitted oral histories. Dr. Helen Grady, the historian who had first explained the economic motives, became the lead researcher. In her preliminary report, she wrote, "Providence Bend represents one of the earliest documented cases of infrastructural dispossession in post-Civil War America. Its erasure combined economic opportunism racial exploitation, and environmental manipulation, a blueprint repeated across the Delta for the next century. Her words drew national attention. Museums began requesting exhibits. Funding poured in from historical foundations. I watched as what had once been a footnote in an engineering report transformed into a national conversation about how America builds, destroys, and remembers. The artifacts speak. During the first authorized survey dive, archaeologists recovered several objects from the riverbed: fragments of pottery, iron hinges, a glass inkwell, and a rusted church bell no larger than a melon. Its inscription was barely legible under centuries of corrosion, but under infrared scanning, the words appeared: Providence Mission Chapel, 1870. The bell's discovery made the evening news. Children from local schools wrote letters asking where the people of Providence went, what songs they sang, what stories they told. For the first time, the descendants of those who had lost everything could point to proof, something they could touch. The descendants gather. In October, a memorial ceremony was held on the riverbank near the cemetery. The state installed a bronze plaque that read, Providence Bend, 1818, 1874. Founded by freedmen after the Civil War. Destroyed in a man-made flood under federal authority. Its people endured. May the river remember what men tried to forget. Families came from across Mississippi and Louisiana. Calvin Dunbar stood before the crowd, holding the same Bible his ancestor had carried from the flood. He read aloud from Amos's 1875 testimony, the words that had once been ignored. We told him this was our home. As the crowd bowed their heads, I felt something I hadn't felt through months of research: closure. Not the tidy kind historians like to file under resolved, but the human kind, the kind that breathes. The cost of silence. Still, the more recognition Providence Bend received, the clearer it became how many other towns had suffered similar fates. Newspaper archives revealed names like True Hope, Eagle Rest, New Canaan. All freedmen settlements marked lost to river course change. Dr. Grady called it the geography of omission. Every bend of the Mississippi had its ghost. Congress quietly commissioned a review of 19th century flood control projects. The report, released in 2025, admitted that non-registered communities may have been displaced during early channel engineering, but stopped short of naming Providence Bend directly. Bureaucracy still guarded its pride. But by then, public awareness had already done what paperwork wouldn't. It restored identity. A town drawn anew. Later that year, a group of graduate students used LiDAR mapping to reconstruct Providence Bend in 3D. The digital model revealed streets, homes, even a two-story structure matching the dimensions of the Providence Mercantile Company plaque I'd found. When the reconstruction premiered at the Delta Museum of History, the audience gasped as the virtual camera descended through the water to show the ghostly grid glowing beneath the river. It looked like the town was waiting to rise again. I stood at the back of the hall, watching faces illuminated by the holographic reflection of a place almost forgotten. No explosions, no secrets now, just quiet awe. Afterward, a child tugged at her mother's sleeve and whispered, "So, they were real." Her mother nodded. They were. That was all the vindication history ever really gets. The river's confession. I returned one last time that autumn. The water was low, exposing cracked ridges of clay where the current had shifted. I waded out until the mud pulled at my boots. Somewhere beneath me lay brick, bone, and silence. The river made no apology. It doesn't need to. It's only ever done what men told it to do. But as I stood there, the wind carried the faint sound of church bells, or maybe it was just the echo of memory. Either way, it felt like Providence Bend was answering back. I thought about Amos Dunbar, about Earl Latimer, who vanished after the government visit, about Marjorie Hollis, who risked her career to send that photograph, and about every unnamed resident who built a home, thinking freedom finally meant permanence. Their stories had been under the water, waiting for someone stubborn enough to listen. The lesson buried in silt history books will one day write that Providence Bend was rediscovered. But rediscovery is the wrong word. You can't rediscover people who never truly disappeared. You can only admit you stopped looking. The Mississippi River runs on, carrying barges, sediment, and secrets. Every time its course changes, I wonder what else it's covering. Maybe another Providence. Maybe another truth that someone will need to dig up a century from now. Because rivers don't keep secrets. People do. Epilogue. The archive opens. In 2024, after public pressure, the National Archives quietly lifted the restriction on the Mississippi River Engineering Division, 1868 to 1879. Among the released documents was the complete text of Order 412A. At the bottom, stamped in faint ink, a postscript read, "Executed, August 4th, 1874. Providence Bend site cleared." No apology, no addendum, just bureaucratic closure. But next to that line, someone, perhaps an archivist decades later, had written in pencil, "Names recovered." And beneath that, a list. 52 names. Men, women, and children once recorded as displaced. They finally had their place in the record. Closing the file, I ended my report with a simple paragraph. Providence Bend was not lost to the river. It was lost to the ledger. Its recovery reminds us that history is not only what survives, but what is allowed to be remembered. That line found its way into museum plaques, documentaries, and classroom lessons. But for me, it remains personal, a voice from the current that refuses to go quiet. On my last visit, as dusk fell and the water shimmered copper beneath the setting sun, I whispered a promise to the river. I found them. Then I turned away, leaving the wind to finish the story in ripples. If this story moved you, subscribe for more American historical mysteries, forgotten events, and hidden secrets like this one.